Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden.
And I'm Meghan Cox Gurdon.
And we are yet again recording this, not knowing the results to the election. This is like the second week in a row where we've dropping well after current events. It's the Thursday after the election, which was on Tuesday.
Right. So this is really, we are a time capsule right now.
We are a time capsule.
What it was like when we didn't know.
I know. I said, yeah, or like we have to go into sort of the time travel. In the last podcast, I said, those of you who know what happens, don't tell us. Spoiler alert. So you listening to this on Tuesday know better than we do what's going on. God knows it may not even be resolved by Tuesday, but the point of this was to be, Meghan, that we booked this podcast so we can now be away from politics entirely, or to the degree that we can go back to talking about our lady parts.
Right. Which is, as we now know, lady is perhaps a pejorative term. I don't know nowadays. And these, everything
our
is
parts.
political. Our parts. Moving parts.
They're not always moving.
Really? You mean that's not normal?
So you're back on the topic of gender.
Yes, very important and highly political, of course.
But
talking to Deborah.
Yeah, well, we've got our guest for this show. I'm so thrilled. She was on maybe a year and a half ago. Dr. Deborah Soh, spelled S-O-H. She is this is my job title, a sexologist and a neuroscientist. But sex is not, it's meaning the correct term, meaning male, female.
Danielle, you could be an amateur sexologist, I'm sure.
I am an amateur sexologist, and I don't mean a scientific way.
Can I just say I'm really excited to be talking to Dr. Deborah Soh in person, to the degree that Zoom makes being in person possible, because, not even 2 years ago, I was at a party. I think you were there too, up in Toronto for the magazine Quillette. My own book was just about to come out, and
The Enchanted Hour, everybody.
The Enchanted Hour, exactly, my book, and in hardcover. That was the first edition, and I was standing right next to Dr. Deborah Soh, whose work I had read, and I was a little bit starstruck, and I really wanted to, talk to her. And I just quailed at the last minute because she has the most fantastic look of glacial hauteur as her natural expression. And so I failed in the moment. I didn't say hello to her. And then maybe the next day, the day after, somewhere I read or saw that she said that she is aware that she has the most phenomenal resting bitch face, and that she has heard that there are people who fear to approach her because of her glacial look. And that was
like the glacial hauteur. That's a very elegant way of saying rest.
Well, I'm not afraid when we're on Zoom, though.
Well, except when the face really does freeze, and then it's
yeah.
Well, she's written, her first book has come out, which is super exciting. It's called The End of Gender: Debunking the Myths About Sex and Identity in Our Society.
I have it right here.
Yep. And anyone who hasn't come across Dr. Deborah's, let's call her Dr. Debbie, Dr. Deb's work, is what is fascinating is she's a genuine neuroscientist who studies the science of biology. She notes that her discipline was also, she has a fancier, more medical term for it, but basically she got very interested in studying kinky sex. People who liked kinky versions. Kinkology. I don't know what it is, but she's looked at what we can do today to brain imaging and scans, all kinds of things that show this idea of multiple genders. Gender fluidity is just not backed by science. And she, of course, has caused some uproar in that, but we like uproar. Meg, as we were preparing for this show, you sent me this funny story that just came out, right, in National Geographic.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah, you captured it in this. This is perfect, wonderful feminist story on one level, and then it completely devolves into this parody.
Okay, so this is National Geographic, right? Studying anthropology, human experience.
Right.
Now you've got the article there, so perhaps you can tell us. So there was a find, right? An archaeological
right. So this was in the Andes in Peru from 9,000 years ago, and it was like a mummified skeleton with very elaborate hunting kit around it, and they assumed that it was a male body, a male hunter. And then when they did, as they can do now, these incredible tests, and they used the tooth enamel, and they found that it was most likely a female.
Right.
And that this was a great sort of breakthrough to this idea that, we always thought men are the hunters, women are the gatherers, but this was a find that potentially said that women could be hunters too, or were hunters.
Or but she could be the leader of hunters.
Packs of them. I don't know, like those girls in the mall. But here was so you're saying, wow, this is quite incredible. This is really upending what we know of these ancient tribes. But then it says, National Geographic's words, importantly, the archaeological team cannot know the individual's gender identity, but rather only biological sex, which, like gender, doesn't always exist on a binary. In other words, they can't say whether the individual lived their life 9,000 years ago in a way that would identify them within their society as a woman.
It's bonkers, isn't it? I told my little daughter about this, my youngest daughter about this, and she said, that's like saying, we're not sure whether the ancient Mesopotamians were Democrats or Republicans. Like,
hang on. What if this mummy was a daddy?
No, but it's very interesting that a magazine like National Geographic would find it necessary to put a paragraph in there like that. A paragraph which, by the way, would not have been placed in that magazine probably 5 years ago or 10 years ago and 15 years ago. It would have looked like complete madness, as it probably will 15 years from now. I mean, that kind of thing. Do you really think that anthropologists are wondering, did she live as a man? Was she?
Well, it would be sort of interesting if there was evidence for it. It's also like saying maybe this hunter was gay,
right. Well, maybe, but
we don't know.
But the thing about it, I think that's important. And this is what, of course, makes this so appropriate to talking, as a run into talking to Dr. Soh, is that that kind of paragraph has to be inserted now into documentation so that the authors are not beset by the furies of the gender identity furies, who really want, who can be quite ferocious in their punishment of people who are styled as skeptical or who do not utter the pieties that have been decided upon just very recently. I mean, and so there are other stories more closer to home and maybe a little sadder than that. Well, can I tell about a story that I think is very sad from the UK that's just happened?
Well, right. That this is having real world consequences in that. And as you point out, I think this National Geographic example is good because here you are in just a journal of seemingly science that they feel the need to put that in. Yeah. And Dr. Soh or Dr. Debbie, she left medical profession. She left academia because she felt she could no longer honestly pursue her studies and research.
That's incredibly dark, isn't it? When you think about it, I mean, Western society since the Enlightenment has been able to look back to the example of Galileo and say, look how much more advanced we are. We consider science. Right. Actually, no, science is now rapidly in the process, as she, I'm sure will tell us, of being silenced and distorted by political activists. So unfortunately, here we are. We're back with politics again. Yeah. But I do want, if people are not following what's going on in the UK, it's really some of the manifestations of this phenomenon are quite extraordinary. This one that just happened actually last month in October was the final broadcast after 33 years on the BBC of a woman named Jenny Murray, who if you've ever lived in the UK or listened to the BBC over there, she has the most beautiful voice. And she hosted for, as I say, 33 years, a program called Woman's Hour. on the BBC. And sometimes it was light, might be a little bit of cooking or a little poetry, something, not that poetry is necessarily light. Sometimes very heavy issues involving women's lives and rights and bodies. And with the push of trans activism in the UK, she, like many women and feminists in her case, thought, well, hang on, that's wonderful if people are transgender, but let's not erase us as women. We are women. We're not some subset. We're not cis women. We're women. That's just what we are. We're biological females, adult females. For this opinion and for writing about this opinion, she was, she was canceled, essentially.
Right. She lost the show. It's like what's the J.K. Rowling?
Yeah, like J.K. Rowling. Same thing in both cases. And I think Deborah Soh has a similar take on this, which is, more power to you. If you are an adult and you feel ill at ease in your body and you have gender dysphoria and you wish to live as the opposite sex, of course, fine. But let's not pretend that all other women are somehow changed in their status. We're still adult human females who are women.
Right. And that's I guess she's called it the end of gender, is that this erasure of any sexual identity, and how and she makes, and we'll talk to her about them, very good points about how this really hurts women, and we can say women, and a lot of the achievements that we have struggled to have today. So let's bring Deborah on. With businesses moving many of their operations off-site and having to make tough decisions about their employees, why not consider using Bambi for your HR and save money? Because when running a business, HR issues can kill you. Wrongful termination suits, minimum wage requirements, labor regulations, and HR manager salaries aren't cheap, an average of $70,000 a year. Bambi, spelled B-A-M-B-E-E, was created specifically for small business. You can get a dedicated HR manager, craft HR policy, and maintain your compliance, all for just $99 a month. With Bambi, you can change HR from your biggest liability to your biggest strength. Your dedicated HR manager is available by phone, email, or real-time chat. From onboarding to terminations, they customize your policy to fit your business and help you manage your employees day to day, all for $99 a month. Month to month, no hidden fees. You can cancel at any time. You didn't start your business because you wanted to spend time on HR compliance. Let Bambi help and get your free HR audit today. So go to Bambi.com/fem right now to schedule your free HR audit. That's Bambi.com/fem, spelled B-A-M to the BEE.com/fem. Deborah, welcome back to the Femsplainers.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you. So thrilled that this book is out. To our listeners who don't understand fully what a sex neuroscientist does, it sounds very sexy, but it's really just because we no longer use the word sex correctly, and use the word gender instead. So give us a little bit about your background and your journey, both as a feminist when you began your life as a scientist and what you discovered along the way.
So during my time in academia, as you mentioned, I studied sex neuroscience. So this is basically what I was doing was using brain imaging techniques to better understand human sexuality and gender. And so my dissertation in particular used brain imaging. So this included functional and structural neuroimaging methods to better understand hypersexuality and also paraphilias, which are unusual sexual preferences. So I usually describe it as people who are very kinky. And as you mentioned,
you specialized in kinky sex, I think.
I did, not personally in my personal life, but yeah, I did as a researcher. And in terms of my journey as a feminist, I mean, I tell people I was a hardcore feminist. I'm still very much in favor of gender equality, of course. But as I learned more about sexology, which is the scientific study of sex and gender, the more I realized that a lot of very prominent feminist tenets are not actually backed by science. In some cases, they're very much anti-science. And I began to see that a lot of the messaging, I think, is actually quite harmful to women and men. So I've distanced myself more recently from calling myself a feminist. But we can go into specific myths, maybe that would be helpful, or the ways in which I feel like that ideology is not helpful to women.
Well, you discovered that there was not a lot of interest in the science of biology, as it were. That when you discovered, or not discovered, you, like other scientists, see that there are real biological differences between men and women, but that goes against this idea, feminist idea, progressive idea that gender is fluid, that it's largely a social construct. And as we find and you find in research, and with all the technology we have now, science just continues to show that there are, in fact, real biological differences. And you point out that there are only, in fact, two genders.
And that this biological fact is so unpopular that biology itself needs to be canceled.
Right, exactly. I make the very contentious claim, apparently, that there are only two genders. I'll mention that with the book, I've set it up as 9 different myths, and I go through for each myth the scientific research explaining why it is a myth. So one of the myths I talk about is gender being a social construct, and it absolutely blows my mind because this is being reported in many mainstream news outlets. This is basically taken for granted now. People just think that that's how it is when that is not factually accurate. And I talk in the book about when James Damore's Google memo happened. This was in 2017. I wrote a column for the Globe and Mail defending his memo. And I said that, yes, there are on average differences in the brains between men and women. This is not to say that some women are more like men or some men are not more like women, or that this should say anything about any individual person. And I was also very clear to point out that with that memo, Damore was not talking about ability, he was talking about interest. So as you're saying, Danielle, now it's completely verboten to say that men and women are different in any way, which again, I think does a disservice to us, because in that case, we're not properly understanding one another. And it's not helpful in terms of things like understanding sex and dating, because I have a chapter on that and how that's really leading young people astray. With regard to, say, occupational interest, this huge narrative that there's a big problem with sexism in STEM, so science and mathematics fields, and that's the reason why we don't see a 50-50 ratio. That's really inaccurate. It's insane to me that I see new scientific papers coming out actually claiming that there are no biologically based sex differences in the brain. And it's, Megan's making a face.
The incredulous face. I mean, anyone who's been alive and walked around and dealt with men and women, or had children or husbands or wives or whatever, can tell you perfectly well that there are definitely differences that we can see on the outside when we're not neurologists. But can you tell us something a little bit about it's crazy that in 2020 we have to talk about biological reality in a way that has, introducing maybe listeners to some of the facts that they may not be acquainted with yet, which are taking place inside their own heads. What would you say, what for the layman is the simplest way to understand the difference between male brains and female brains in the aggregate, stipulating, as you said, that there's going to be a little bit of overlap in propensities and type?
Well, we could look at different aspects of, say, the structure of the brain. So with white matter, which is the connective tissue, on average, so again, this is not to say this is the case for every single person, but it's just not accurate to say if you look at male brains and female brains on average that there are no differences at all, or that those differences are due purely to socialization. So if you say look at white matter, you'll see that there are a greater number of connections running from the front to the back of the brain in men, and a greater number running interhemispherically, so this is left to right and right to left in women. So I don't think acknowledging differences is sexist. I make it very clear in the book, I think it's only sexist when you use those differences to discriminate against certain particular people, or to say one sex is better than the other. And if we deny these differences and pretend they don't exist, like you're saying, most people know intuitively that doesn't sound right. So when they do come across information that shows, yes, there are biologically based differences in the brain. People who are legitimately sexist are going to say this information was hidden because it's proof that women are inferior. So I think I'm very much in favor of just talking honestly about what the scientific data say, and to be very clear what they do not say. So to say, yes, there are these differences. No, that does not justify discriminating against women, holding women back, saying women should only have certain types of jobs, or that we should only be allowed to be in the kitchen and having making babies, things like that.
Well, this idea that men and women, to the degree that there are differences, obviously physical differences, but everything else is socialized, has been around since I was a young woman and longer. That was, and Megan's nodding because she and I both sort of came of age at the same time. And that was the big, wonderful feminist push, is that, hey, we can be like men. We can lead the same sexually independent lives as men, yada, yada, yada. So what has changed, though, and what is fascinating about your book is this idea that there are no real differences has taken on a much more emphatic form, in that we now have this concept of complete gender fluidity. So it's not just that men and women are similar, there shouldn't be much differences. It's that there are more than two genders or sexes, whatever you want to say. You said in your book, you make the note, 10% of millennials identify with alternative genders, and a third of Gen Z knows someone who uses the they pronoun. So explain what is happening here, especially to people who are sort of not realizing why they have to call other people they rather than, which just seems ungrammatical. Talk about this.
Say that I'm just thrilled to find that, my inner identification with large foliage has finally, I found a word for it. It's arbor gender. I'm arbor gender. Which means,
does that mean you identify as a plant?
As a tree, apparently. and puzzle gender. When you have a gender that feels like this, of course, is from Deborah's book. It feels like you have a gender that feels like it needs to be pieced together.
Yeah. My other favorite. What is this? Tell us. Explain.
My other favorites are moon gender, which means your gender only comes out at night, and astrogender, which means that you're like an astronaut floating around in space trying to figure out what your gender is.
Do you think there's a lot of drugs involved in these identifications?
You know what? The crazy thing is no, which is, I think, it speaks to the state where we are in terms of gender theory and how prominent it's become. So for your audience, I'll define briefly. Gender non-binary refers to people who identify as a third gender. Usually it's some combination of both genders or neither, both male and female or neither. And then there are all these different terms that go along with that. The most common ones would be probably gender neutral, gender fluid, gender queer, even though queer to me is still is a slur against the gay community, so I don't like to use that word, agender, bigender, and then a whole plethora of other ones that I list in the book. So my issue, I will use the pronoun someone wants me to use if they are transgender. If they are non-binary, I will use they, them. My issue is that it's not backed by the science. So gender is binary. And I think for the vast majority of us, the way we feel about our gender may change over time. But from this perspective, if you feel different about your gender in any way, or if you're a mix of masculine and feminine, that means you're not male or female, that you are this other third category. And I don't see why we have to categorize people who are different as a different gender. I think it's totally acceptable if you are a masculine woman or a feminine man to still be a man or a woman and just be slightly different or be gender nonconforming. So I think it's part of a larger push to really redefine what it means to be a man or not a man or woman, but within the transgender umbrella, it's to inflate the numbers of people who potentially could be categorized as trans. So transgender used to mean someone who identifies more as the opposite sex than their birth sex. And I'm completely in favor of equal rights and respect and legal protections for trans people, for intersex people, for people who are gender nonconforming. I always want to be very clear about that. But my issue is when this ideology starts to infect the scientific research that's being done, and when activists start telling scientists what they can and can't say and what they should be allowed to study. So in this case, it's not backed by the science. Biological sex for 99% of us dictates our gender. Biological sex is binary. So we produce either eggs or sperm. There's no intermediate gamete. So sex is binary, and then gender is also binary. So with the trans umbrella being expanded, now it's not just people who identify as the opposite sex. Now it's beginning to include people who are non-binary, and you'll have people who are transgender who identify as the opposite sex. So basically binary transgender people saying, we are not the same. There's actually quite a bit of infighting going on in the community in terms of people who have taken on I think, very difficult decision to live as the opposite sex, to undergo, in some cases, medical transition. They are saying we're not the same as people who identify as a third gender, who in most cases just change their haircut, maybe start wearing makeup or change their makeup and their clothes and take on different pronouns and now want to call themselves trans. But if you say that, me saying this now is considered transphobic, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. I don't think there's anything hateful about what I'm saying. I'm saying you can identify however you want, but I think at the same time, there are certain basic truths that we should be allowed to talk about.
What you're saying is really not very different, although yours has a scientific buttressing to it, from what J.K. Rowling was saying when she got into so much trouble with the trans world. I know that Danielle and I are both really interested in talking with you about the real world effects of some of this, for instance, sex and dating, or dating and relationships. But I just have a question for you, just with regard to what you were just saying about the degree of ferocity that is attached to this topic. Why is it so ferocious? Why is it that, a subject which the general public is, of course, very well aware of it now, but, for a long time, this was it was not a mainstream discussion. And it's as though I don't want to speculate, but it's extraordinary the degree to which, mild demurrals or a reference to the science is, as you say, characterized as phobia or the denying of people's right to exist. It's remarkably hysterical, to use an old-fashioned term. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, there's a lot of rhetoric like that, which I think is completely unnecessary. And I think part of it is that, so number one, I don't think most the really vocal, belligerent, aggressive trans activists speak for the majority of transgender people. I don't think they even necessarily reflect most trans activists. And I talk in the book about one experience I had interviewing a trans activist, and she was actually quite lovely. I was concerned because I wasn't sure. I thought the conversation would take a really dark, awful turn, but it ended up being quite fine, wonderful even. So I think for the ones who are extremely aggressive and who are really intent on trying to destroy the lives of anyone who speaks out about this or who counters particular narratives, I think it comes from their own potentially psychopathology, something that they are not at peace with in themselves. And I think they're getting support from all of these major institutions. If you look at medical institutions, scientific organizations, academic institutions, they will back these activists in their anti-scientific claims. And they will back them also in their intimidation and bullying and threatening of legitimate scientists, which I find absolutely appalling. And for myself as a journalist, I have more freedom to speak to the science of any of this than any of my colleagues who are tied to an academic institution, which is completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Let me amplify just on, Meghan, what you said, because one of the things when I talk about this, for instance, with my adult children, and we had Abigail Schreier on earlier in the summer, and she's written a book about this phenomenon of young girls suddenly deciding that they're trans. And it's a real phenomenon, but they would say, well, why do we care? Why is this a problem? So let's say there are whatever small percentage of the population want to say that they're gender fluid or whatever. Why should we care? Why should J.K. Rowling get upset? What is, as Meghan says, the real world consequences of this?
Because when these policies, medical policies, social policies, are not based in science, they're not going to be effective in helping people. And in fact, they're going to be quite harmful to people, and especially the children. So definitely rapid onset gender dysphoria is a real phenomenon. It's also considered very controversial to talk about this. And we see there are huge numbers of young women who are coming out now who are saying, I transitioned to male or a third gender. I underwent particular medical interventions like hormones. In some cases, they had a double mastectomy, and they're saying this was not the right decision for me. And they've since gone back to identifying as female. They will say that there are other things going on in their life. Usually for many of them, they are on the autism spectrum. A lot of them are lesbian and experience homophobia. Some of them have a history of sexual trauma. Some have eating disorders. And those were not things that were talked about before they transitioned. And talking about those things in a therapeutic setting would have been more effective, because the issues that they had with their gender were not really about gender. It was maybe manifesting as gender, or in some cases, a therapist told them it was probably due to their gender, but it wasn't. It was due to something else. And so if you transition, and I always want to say I'm in favor of adults transitioning, because I think adults have the cognitive capacity to make that kind of a decision. But for children, and especially for young people who make this decision very quickly, it's not going to make you feel better. And that's the purpose of transitioning, is to help someone, if they're going to live as the opposite sex, hopefully that's going to be something that's going to make their life better. If it doesn't make their life better, it doesn't make sense to do it.
So I wanted to talk about, if we could, another aspect of the real world consequence, which we've alluded to already, and that is the way in which, let us say, even if you're not in remotely, experimenting with being an arbor gender person or a moon gender person or a bigender or a transgender or any of the other, kind of as it one to another kind of states of being. It's almost hard to talk about this without somehow feeling as though you're going to walk into something difficult. But just does garden variety men and women going about their business in society. You write in the book about this, some of the unfortunate knock-on effects that come from pretending that, that there's more than, that biological sex isn't real and there's more than one gender, or more than two, excuse me. So I'm just going to quickly, I'm talking here about myth number 7, which is women should behave like men in sex and dating. And you write here, it's totally fine to be critical of social norms. That is to say, extreme femininity, extreme masculinity. But the denial of evolution is one of the most damaging myths I've encountered, because it throws everything we know about human sexual behavior out the window. It actually hurts women to behave like men, and vice versa, when it comes to courtship and sex. This is the case regardless of one's political affiliation. Amazing that one has to say that, but one does. You say, drawing upon biological or evolutionary explanations for behavior, or even hinting that abiding by traditional gender roles might actually help us when it comes to romantic relationships, leads to allegations that one, in this case you, think a woman's only purpose in life is to look pretty, have babies, and be subservient to men. Although, having had lots of babies, is that so wrong? I have to say. But what you're saying in the book here is that you're highlighting what the data are telling us, because single young people are experiencing mass confusion. So what are the data telling us as far as young people and the mass confusion of gender?
One point I wanted to mention before we discuss this topic regarding Danielle's question. The other thing with young women that concerns me is that they're being told if they don't like development during puberty, that means they are not women. And I'm not sure about you guys, but I remember when I went through puberty and I started getting my period and I started developing breasts, I was not thrilled. And my body is quite androgynous compared to, say, some of my girlfriends. And they will tell me they really dislike their breasts when they first started developing. And now young women are being given this option that they don't like how they feel. They don't like that they have to adjust to changes. They don't like the sexual attention they're getting, that they can go get surgery and take care of it that way. So as for how the confusion is manifesting with young people, I would get so many messages from young women saying to me that they're receiving this messaging from media, from television, telling them to be like men in terms of how they should go about relationships and sex. And they were saying that something about it didn't quite resonate with them. It's funny because so that chapter 7, an excerpt of that was run in Globe and Mail, and the feedback I got from that, I was quite relieved to some extent, because you always get it from, I think, both sides. You get the people who will say, this makes total sense to me, because that excerpt went to number 1 on the Globe and Mail's website within an hour. So I couldn't believe it. And so, thank you. So young women are saying, oh, I'm so glad you said this. I see my girlfriends going out and having casual sex and they're really miserable. And then I had the other side of people saying that I'm a misogynist, and I'm saying that I'm in favor of regressive ideas about women. I probably have a terrible sex life, all these things. And I'm just amazed that I think evolutionary psychology should be mandatory reading for all of us to better understand. I mean, not even in terms of our sex life, just how to relate to one another. And it is seen as sexist nowadays. And to say that, yes, men and women come from this evolutionary lineage, I suppose, that has been very helpful to us. And that just because that information could be misused to, again, say that women are quote unquote hysterical, or that that justifies bad behavior in men, that men should be allowed to cheat or rubberneck at other women, things like that. No, it doesn't say that. We can acknowledge, on average, most women are not going to be as interested in casual sex. Most women are going to be more interested in a relationship, because it makes sense. Sex comes with a greater investment. And even though birth control exists, this has only been around for the last 60 or so years. So that doesn't override this history, millions of years of evolution. And I think if you listen to the scientific research, I mean, I've applied this to my own life. I find it really helpful. Otherwise, what you're going to find, especially as a woman, is if you believe the feminist outlook on sex differences and how women should approach sex, the only men that you're going to attract to you, or the only men that you're going to want to date, are men who are lying to you, because these are men who are telling you what you want to hear instead of who they actually are. And okay, that's not to say that all men are exactly the same, of course, but on average, I talk in that chapter, one example I had of a man who told me that he didn't look at pornography when he was dating someone he liked. And I knew right off the bat he's lying, because men are, on average, more interested in sexual novelty and visual input. And that's not to say that's not to say that's an excuse for bad behavior or cheating, but someone who's going to tell you what you want to hear is doing that because he knows that's what he should say. He's not.
Yeah, you called it the male feminist. Beware. I think, and my daughters know this, that the minute a guy says he's a feminist, it's like, okay, check.
Run.
But no, what is fascinating too is your point that this puts women at such a disadvantage, because it is this refuse. If you're saying there are no differences, and this is why J.K. Rowling's getting into trouble, because suddenly these women's spheres and women's aspects of women's health that we have fought for so long to be taken seriously, the minute now you just say people with vaginas or not vaginas, wipes
bleeders.
out.
Bleeders,
Yeah.
Danielle.
Oh, what?
Bleeders.
Oh,
that's the new one.
But as some of us have pointed out on this program before, we're not bleeders anymore. So where does that put us? But tell us about some of these disadvantages. I mean, it's J.K. Rowling got in trouble for suggesting that it's not just about bathrooms, although there's points to be made about that, but like putting trans women in women's prisons where they've had problems, having them come to battered women shelters, that whole areas of women's health that used to have, the reason we broke it out from general health was because it wasn't getting studied separately, from male health. Like female heart attacks are different from male heart attacks. And it's important to know that. So it seems like, I think you made this great point that those who say gender is a construct, which means being gay is also like a choice, are now on the side of the evangelicals, the right, who say, well, if it's all a choice, you should be able to change it or quote unquote fix it. And it takes away from the real biological people that we are.
Right. And I make the point in the book, too, that if we pretend that men and women are the same, so as you're saying with health research, or say with research about human sexuality, it's not going to apply to women because they're just going to study it in men because it's easier. But something like brain imaging, if you're going to look at female sexuality, you have to take into account the menstrual cycle. So researchers, if they had the option, if they're trying to understand human sexuality and men and women are the same, they're just going to use male participants because they're not going to have to even take that variable into account. So it's really doing a disservice to women in the end. And then when it comes to the issue of trans women and whether trans women are the same as women, I do have a chapter in the book talking about this. And whatever I do talk about, I do feel in some ways like if I feel insensitive because it's as though I'm telling some individuals who they really are, and that's not my intention. But I do think to pretend that there are no differences, again, is not helpful. And I think I've had many trans women reach out to me who will say, yes, of course, there are some differences. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be treated the same as everyone else. But a lot of the things that activists are asking for in terms of things like prison and sports are not things that most trans women would ever ask for because they understand that there are concerns there. Something like prison. I used to work clinically and in a research capacity with incarcerated sex offenders. You cannot, I mean, it blows my mind that we do see this happening where someone will be arrested as male, having committed a sexual offense against a woman. This person will then decide that they actually identify as female and they will be transferred to a female prison. And as someone who works with offenders, and they lie. I mean, sex offenders they're always lying, and you have to do a proper assessment to determine. I mean, maybe in some cases, some of them do legitimately experience gender dysphoria, but it's this activism it's everywhere now, and it's really impeding the ability for people to do their jobs properly, to have reasonable conversations. To me, I think it really depends on the level of risk. So something like bathrooms, I don't have as much of an issue if trans women want to use women's bathrooms. Prisons and shelters, no, I don't agree with that. I think it depends, again, on whether someone is preoperative or postoperative. Something like a situation with a shelter, you're spending a lot of time with, say, your roommate, you sleep next to each other, you're very vulnerable in some cases. And a lot of the women in shelters also have a history of abuse. A lot of them have issues with substances, and it can be legitimately triggering. I mean, the word triggering is misused nowadays, but for someone who's trauma, it can legitimately bring about their trauma to be in the presence of someone who is preoperative. So we have, I mean, it just blows my mind when I see the way that this issue is being talked about in regards to sexual offending. And then with sports, it's the same thing. It's how is this even happening where you see anyone who speaks out against this is called names. And I really think unless things change, we're going to see the end of women's sports, because what's going to stop someone from identifying as female if they know that they can potentially have a competitive advantage when it comes to elite sports?
Well, and in fact, you're right. I mean, one of the difficulties here is that in the erasure of the categories, it's a situation which allows liars and grifters to take advantage, and I mean, it is, I can imagine that it would be hurtful for trans people to think, to imagine that they're being thought of as predators in prisons. But, there's one very spectacular, notorious case in Britain where I think this person goes by the name Karen, where it would, as an armchair doctor, I would say that looks like a serious case of mental illness and grifting as well. But the authorities who have, permitted the extinguishing of the proper characteristics or proper distinction have no way now I guess the law is changing, so we'll see what happens there. But, it's as though the whole vocabulary of being able to talk honestly about what is really happening is denied to us. When I was reading your book, I was reminded of an old saying that I looked up. This is from G.K. Chesterton. You might remember this. It's his metaphor of the fence. He says, don't ever take a fence down until you know the reason it was put up. And I think that applies in this case with the distinctions between male and female sports, male and female housing in prisons and other facilities. those divisions exist for a reason, and it's not angry patriarchy that makes the reason necessary. There are objective and reasonable and traditional reasons why we protect girls in a different way than we protect boys. Women have fought for these protections and for this distinction. And it is, for some it's very frightening, and for others it's outraging that men are coming along and essentially appropriating women's spaces and women's status.
But the crazy thing to me is I think some people are so ideological that they don't even understand that biology plays into it, because I see people asking with, say, something like sports, they'll say, why is there such an issue around trans women? Why do people not care about trans men as well? And I'm sitting there, I'm completely dumbfounded, because I'm thinking, do you have no understanding of biology? But the thing is, biology, like you said, and also biological sex, you cannot talk about it anymore. That's seen just from the get-go hateful, and there are going to be horrible consequences as a result of that.
Well, this kind of false consciousness that we are all living with, which I think is my generation of women, that this constant imploration to not be yourself, not let yourself have the desires that you think of as female. I mean, it's a deeply sexist premise that anything thought to be feminine is worse than masculine or is weaker. I don't just mean physically. And we now see, as you said, this incredible confusion among men and women. We saw it in this past election. This is like the biggest gender gap ever recorded. It feels like men and women have never been so far apart and detached from each other and not living with each other and not marrying each other. And I wonder why is this, all this gender fluidity becoming an issue now? Because it's as if people are seeking even more reasons to explain why I don't get along with men or I don't get along with women. We have to come up with all these, different types of genders to explain something that, because we won't look at the science or biology, we won't accept it. If that makes sense.
Right. And I think, feminism, when I was a feminist, I would say feminism does not stand for man hating, but I do think to some extent it does now. You would see like big name feminists or popular mainstream feminists who will vocally advocate for hating men. And that's probably part of it. I think also when we go back to how evolutionary psychology and evolutionary explanations for sexual behavior are frowned upon, women feel that to ask their male partners for any sort of investment is seen as high maintenance, or that that's somehow making them dependent on a man, or they're not fully empowered.
Oh, could you talk about that? I loved that in your book where you as this strong feminist would say, you actually had why you felt men should pick up the check on the first date and why they should make the first move. Just talk about that a little. And then you say, they look at me like I'm sexist, but there are real biological underpinnings. I think a lot of young women would love to hear this. Absolutely.
Because if you don't require a man to invest in you, he's not going to value you. That's ultimately what it's going to come to. Of course, there are.
But what is the evolutionary
exceptions.
Science behind that?
Well, because men on average want to spread their seed and they want to have lots of sex with lots of different partners. So if they have not invested in a partner, they have no reason to stick around. I mean, that sounds terrible, but that's what it eventually breaks down to. So if you don't require a man to invest in you from day one, he's not going to take you seriously. Most women, as I said, are looking for a relationship. Research has actually shown that most women will engage in casual sex as a hope that the man will want to engage in a relationship with her. But for men, sex is just sex. So they're not thinking if you have a friends with benefits agreement with someone, or if you are having a one-night stand, he's not thinking about your future together. Women may be, or more likely to be, but men really are not. So I do say men should pay on the first date. Men should initiate interest, because otherwise, as a woman, if you're the one chasing after him and you're the one investing, I've heard all kinds of horror stories that I won't get into, but just in the ways that women, because I bought this idea too. If you are empowered and you're independent, you can be like a man and you can approach sex and dating like a man. And it really doesn't help us in that way because men are just going to say, great, this is free sex. I don't have to do anything. And you're not ultimately going to get, if what you want is a relationship, you're not going to get it. If you just want sex from this person, then I don't think it really matters. But for the most part, in terms of what I see, women get hurt in the end because they want this thing and the guy won't give it to them. And then what they find is he goes off and the next partner he ends up settling down and marrying her. And the woman is sitting there wondering, why didn't that happen for her?
2020 has already reshaped how we work. And thank goodness it's almost over. And businesses across the globe are challenged to be their most efficient, which means every hire is critical. Indeed is here to help. Indeed is the #1 job site in the world with more total visits than any other job site, according to ComScore. Indeed helps you find quality candidates quickly so you can focus on hiring the person you need to keep your business going. Unlike other sites, Indeed gives you full control and payment flexibility over your hiring. You only pay for what you need. You can pause your account at any time, and there are no long-term contracts. And now, Indeed's new way of matching you with candidates instantly delivers a short list of quality candidates whose resumes on Indeed match your job criteria you can contact the moment you sponsor a job, making Indeed the only job site that can move as fast as you do. 73% of online job seekers in the U.S. are visiting Indeed each month, according to ComScore, total visits. So it's clear Indeed can help get you the quality hire you need. That's why more than 3 million businesses worldwide use Indeed for hiring. So right now, Indeed is offering our listeners a free $75 credit to boost your job post, which means more quality candidates will see it fast. Try Indeed out with a free $75 credit at Indeed.com/femsplain. This is their best offer available anywhere. Go right now to Indeed.com/femsplain. Offer is valid through December 31st. Terms and conditions apply.
I was very struck when I learned that when men and women have sex, the woman experiences afterwards a flood of oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone. The man does not experience that. As I understand it, you will know better, but which in itself just tells you that, that we are very different. And these exchanges, as it were, these transactions have real consequences for women, and they might not have of a similar emotional type for men. They simply don't experience that desire to have a kind of union with the woman afterwards. And the woman does have that. And you can see how damaging, a lot of casual sex would be, because your little heart's involved, whether you want it to be involved or not.
Right. And there have been studies looking at rebounds. So when someone goes out and they have a fling after a breakup, and they find that men after a rebound, they feel better, but women feel worse. And it's sad. And so I think you could look at something like that and say, as a woman, if you're aware that this tends to be the trend, if you are upset or heartbroken after breaking up with someone, you may not want to go out and find someone new right away. You might want to wait off on that, because if you go ahead and do that and you're hurt after, and I think women sometimes try to deny those feelings, or they feel like something's wrong with them for feeling that way because they don't understand why men are not like that. And in that way, they think that they're defective. And so that was part of also my reason for wanting to write that chapter, was to say to women, there's nothing wrong with the way that we are. I think the information and knowledge is useful because you can use that to help you.
Danielle, this reminds me of your book, actually.
I know. I tried writing a long time ago.
No, I mean, Danielle, as you know, Deborah wrote a wonderful book about and a lot of what I loved about your book, Danielle, was that that as women, for some reason, we are I don't know where we get this. It leaches out through the culture with feminism, perhaps. But we feel a little ashamed of our own femininity sometimes, or our feminine desires, our feminine pleasures. They seem somehow second rate compared to, important masculine measures. And that's just not so. And it's not right. And it's not just sex that in which, that's not the only realm in which we kind of deny what really makes us happy. And truth exists, right? So women really are women. We really do we are women, and we experience the world as women, and we have women's bodies, and we have women's brains, as you say. that's something to be celebrated and embraced rather than denied and deprecated, I think.
Well, one of the things that, like you said earlier, and that I learned from your book, Deborah, it's part of the phenomenon that is causing these young women to decide that if they're uncomfortable with their bodies or they have other psychological issues, it must be because they want to become the opposite sex. And what I hadn't realized, but what you said earlier was, so if you're experiencing your first period or first year of menstruation, and yeah, it sucks, no getting around it, that you're saying that that's just another reason to hate being a woman, is to even the very basic things that we go through as women. We're now being taught that we shouldn't have to put up with this, or we should just change ourselves and it will go away. I mean,
yeah, I mean, with the whole push for casual sex, just going back to that, I do get where that's coming from, because sexism does exist. It still exists today. I don't deny that. But so I think it's that idea that women should not be held to a different standard from men. So if men are allowed to go out and sleep around and not have their behavior frowned upon, then why shouldn't women be able to? And I get that. But my issue is more that it's almost as though if women are not behaving in that way, they're seen as unenlightened, or they're seen as something being wrong with them. And I guess the same thing with going through puberty. Female puberty is different from male puberty. And I wish it could be celebrated a little bit more. There could be more positivity around it, instead of it being, for many young women now, something that they want to opt out of. And there isn't that other side of the conversation saying, why aren't we looking at this and saying how, I mean, it's hard for me to say it's special when you're balled up on the couch and cramps, right? But but
remember that there was times, and I think especially in the 70s, I remember Are You There, God Is Me Margaret? It's like, this is a big ritual passage. It's womanhood. And yes, it's painful, but it's also such a incredible moment of a milestone.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's a general frightening turn against science that we're going through right now? I mean, as you say, on the left, it's this denial of biology. On the right, it's the denial of climate change or even COVID. You know, that. So we're sort of seeing a backlash against science. It seems to be hostage to politics, and not just in biology.
Yeah, it's really bad. I didn't think it was ever going to get this bad. I mean, my reason for leaving academia was because I found that the climate was becoming so stifling, and I wanted to write about the issue of transitioning children and how this was not a good idea. And I ended up leaving the academy for that very reason. Since I left, I mean, it's been a couple of years, and it's just gone so much worse. Around gender in particular, it's just, I would say, it's next to impossible to do good research about anything pertaining to gender dysphoria, even sexual orientation. I have a bunch of examples in the book, because the final chapter is about how activism it's not appropriate, that it's basically infecting sex research and the academy. And it really is destroying our ability to do good research. And it's destroying the way that the public talks about any of these issues. I'm thinking even in Canada, we have this bill that's about to be passed that's criminalizing any therapy that does not affirm a child with gender dysphoria. So if a practitioner is found guilty of this, they can face up to 5 years in prison, which is really scary.
That means, I think Abigail talked about this happening down here as well, that if a child, and we're talking children, we're talking even 11, 12-year-olds, not even necessarily 15 or 16-year-olds. And they come to you and they say, I think I'm a boy, or I think I'm a girl. And you don't immediately affirm that, you get in trouble. Is that right? Like, as a therapist?
Right. So in the US, they call it conversion therapy, even though it's not. It's not the same as conversion therapy for sexual orientation, which I do not support, because attempts to change someone's sexual orientation do not work. Gender identity is different because it can change, especially in children. They can change in terms of how they feel about their gender, which is why it doesn't make sense for them to transition prior to puberty, because the vast majority outgrow their gender dysphoria. They're more likely to grow up to be gay in adulthood and not be transgender. So in the US, they call it conversion therapy. It's been banned in 20 states. And that's essentially what it is. So my colleagues who are clinicians, I don't do clinical work anymore, but they will tell me that they cannot do their jobs. And so what happens is most of them will end up leaving. They will not work with people with gender dysphoria because they don't feel they can do their work ethically. The ones who continue working with these patients are usually close to retirement, so they're not as afraid, because if they get fired, they don't care. But it's been really surreal to see how this has played out over time, having been on the inside. And sex researchers especially, we saw this coming. We saw this because we were the first ones to really experience any kind of backlash for speaking out about this. And now it's just been amplified on a much larger level. And what I see happening in a few years is there's going to be huge waves of detransitioners, these children who essentially say, this was not the right choice for me. How did the adults in my life, how did the medical professionals sign off on this? And I predict all of the medical professionals who are calling people like me all these awful names right now, they're going to turn around and pretend they had no idea that this was going to happen. And they're going to say, wow, this is really terrible. And you know, it's going to be devastating for these kids. It really upsets me to think about it. And that's why I am so outspoken about it, because I'm trying to prevent what I see coming.
This is happening in the UK, as I'm sure you're aware. There are detransitioners now who say, what on earth were the adults in my life thinking? Why did they put me on these hormones? And you know, because as well, I guess as we've much discussed, you know, detransitioning doesn't mean you go right back to where you were before. You know, people are forever altered by these large amounts of hormones, and there is no return. It's just another, you know, a very difficult place to be. There will be lawsuits, of course. Okay, so we've talked about some fairly dark stuff, and I know that we want, you know, you're a busy author. We want to make sure you're telling everybody everything that's in your book. But I wondered if you have any. Is there, you know, with the darkness of this time and the topic, is there something that individuals can do? Do you think? You know, as we interact with the people around us, people who are just not necessarily in public life in any way, but you know, how can we resist this silencing of common sense and the denial of biology? Just, is there something we can do apart from at the ballot box? What can we do, if anything?
I always advocate for people to be as vocal as they can be, even in small ways, even with the people in your life. I understand it can be terrifying. Someone like me, I can say this because I've set my life up in a way that I have this freedom, and people in my life, my personal life, they all know what I think about all of this stuff. So the people who, they may not necessarily agree with me, but they at least respect me enough that we can have a difference of opinion. I have lost friends over the years, but that's fine because you make new friends. So I always tell people, you would be surprised the number of people who secretly agree with you, even people who are close to you. You may have no idea, and you both may be staying quiet because you think the other person is going to judge you for saying what you really think. And in the book, I talk about one of my friends in graduate school who I assumed, when I'm still calling myself a liberal, but I think when you are part of the dominant political, well, I would say progressivism is dominating culturally right now. When you're part of that, you don't necessarily stop to realize that not everyone thinks like you until you have a reason to become aware of that. So I had my awakening. I think many more people are probably more awake than some of us realize. And just put feelers out and see, because you'd be surprised. In terms of the feedback I get from people, I mean, in terms of the feedback for the book, it's been extremely positive. People have been telling me that they really appreciate that the science was written in a way that the average layperson could understand. All the citations are there, so you can look it up if you want to learn more about these topics. And they say that I'm very reasonable, and they were surprised. I don't know what people expect of me, but they said you're very compassionate. So that to me speaks volumes, because I think most people secretly agree, and they're not okay with a lot of this stuff, but they are afraid. They're afraid of losing their job. They're afraid of people alienating them socially. They're afraid of potentially getting mobbed if they say the wrong thing on social media. And that's the only way I think it can get better. I also advocate for scientists to just keep doing good work, because at some point I think there will be a turning point where all the good scientists are going to leave, and so there are going to be consequences from that. There's no way, because as you're saying, the truth exists. The truth will always come out, and we're just in a really dark time right now. But it's not going to be like this forever, I hope.
Yeah.
I think especially dealing with younger children who are going through this, and the parents that Abigail was talking about, who usually are the most lovely, liberal parents who just want to do the best for their kids, understand their kids, are open to this concept that, and then suddenly find themselves going down this path. It's not so much just, okay, honey, you're John, I'll call you John now instead of Jessica. It does get into the hormone blockers, the testosterone injections, and really physically invasive things, let alone what they now call top and bottom surgery, but we would call mastectomy for top surgery. But they said, Abigail said, like in a lot of cases, the parents who just pulled their kid out of their environment, like one woman just moved her family across the country, put her in another school. I think of when you're saying, I mean, what our kids have asked us. My daughter, actually both my daughters at some point wanted to have tattoos. Meghan, I'm sure you've been through this.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm thinking, tattoo, like you're going to be 40 and you're going to have this tacky rose on your ankle, or you're going to have something spelled in Chinese that you think says life, but is really, fried rice, or somebody's played a joke on you. And that's a tattoo. I mean, can you imagine at 15 or 16 or 17 taking these much more drastic steps? And I just said to them both at the time, okay, look, when you're 21 and your brain has stopped largely growing and you're mature and you can decide, go ahead, get a tattoo. But this idea that you are delegating such a massive, making these massive life-changing decisions for 13, 14, 15-year-olds is just terrifying. And because we're in this denial of science.
Well, it speaks to how the parents are being emotionally manipulated, because they're being told if they don't allow their child to transition, the child's going to commit suicide.
Right.
And I think any parent, understandably, because I've had many conversations with these parents and I understand. In the book, I talk about one face-to-face conversation I had with a parent asking me for advice. And I wrote that particular chapter to speak to the parents, because it is very difficult to, without meeting the child and without knowing them very well, I don't feel it's appropriate for me to tell them what they should do. And also, I mean, his child was on puberty blockers at that point, and they really believe it. And this suicide statistic that gets thrown around, it is in adults. It has nothing to do with children. So it's part of a larger movement that I don't think even cares about these kids. I think it's about pushing an agenda that the adults have decided on, the activist groups have decided on, and the children are just one part of a larger goal or mission that they have. Right.
And they find it online. Like I think you wrote about this too, that you just start going on YouTube or wherever, and you can, it's like falling into a cult of denial of biology and encouraging people not to put any belief in biology.
Right. Because when you think about being a teenager, we were all trying to figure out who we are, and we all go through fads and phases. And that's not to say that some of these kids who are gender dysphoric, some of them, I think a small percentage would probably benefit from transitioning, but mental health professionals can't do their jobs properly. But what we see with the larger trend is that these young people feel they don't fit in, or they feel there's something amiss with them, which is very typical of being a young person. And then they're being told on the internet by, in some cases, adults, that they should transition. And, and I talk in the book about some examples where they're being given, some adults will share their hormones with them, things like that. It's totally inappropriate. And I can't imagine what it would be like. I mean, like you're saying, their brains are not fully developed yet. If you're searching for an answer and this is given to you as the definitive answer, why wouldn't you do it? If it's supposed to make you feel better, you're being told that it's going to solve all your problems, all the discomfort you feel. It's beyond me that this is happening to these kids because they're vulnerable. They don't know.
Right. And and as you said, and with adults who want to do this, a sort of a reputable doctor will urge you to, if you're a man, to live as a woman for a year before taking any further steps. And, why can't these children wait till 21 or 22? And then, just get them through this time.
Well, the argument,
anything drastic.
The argument, of course, is that only by acting quickly can you outwit biology, right?
That's right.
You can stop them from going through puberty, then they're more malleable. They don't, yeah. It's
it's
not good for you.
All right. Well, Deborah, the book is The End of Gender, Debunking the Myths About Sex and Identity in Our Society. It's so interesting, so important. And thank you again for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I really hope that you guys aren't canceled as a result of this.
No, it's hard to cancel us, honestly. You have nowhere really to cancel us from. So, all
right. Bye, fellow cervix havers,
bleeders,
bye, menstruators.
Okay, well, that was fun, you post bleeder.
Oh, yuck. I'm kind of squeamish about that stuff. And I don't live
to be considered unladylike.
Well, indeed, my dear. I will tell you that. So at the very beginning of our conversation with Deborah, she referred to the term paraphilias. This is part of her sort of the kinky side of her research in her earlier, scientific life. And in reading her book, The End of Gender, I came across one philia, which I hope is developed around me later, in the decades to come. And that is gerontophilia.
Oh, and not Torontophilia, which is
not Torontophilia. I mean, I've been through that phase. I'm covered. I'm a kind of Torontophilia. But no. Gerontophilia is I guess, I don't know if we call it a disorder or a propensity, let's say, to attach
or a really awesome trait.
Yeah, well, attached to the elderly. So
I thought it was it's not like younger, attractive lifeguard men looking for women of a certain age.
I think to be a real gerontophiliac, it probably has to be quite an advanced age.
Oh, okay.
Like that old movie Harold and Maude. Do you remember?
Yes.
Although that was quite non-sexual, if I remember correctly. But
yeah, well, that's I guess where. But then, what if you are both old? You and your partner, does that then count as just normal sexuality, or does that count?
I think it's mutual gerontophilia, probably.
I like the moon. The moon
gender.
Moon gender. And your gender only comes out after night. Like, what are you, werewolf?
And at daylight savings time, you have to get changed earlier.
Oh dear. Yeah. Okay. Well, the world
wonders.
The world is in trouble where, tree genders, the people who like to have sex with earth genders. Okay. All right.
It's too much. It's madness. Again, as one has to stipulate, obviously gender dysphoria is real. Not mocking people who have gender dysphoria. It's a real struggle. But it does feel in other respects like we're living through an extraordinary time of hysteria and like Salem, a couple hundred years ago. And we will come back to, future generations will look back on this and think, what were they thinking?
Well, I don't know. Or we could all be, post-science and back into some modern form of dark age. But
well, let me just tell you, 9,000 years from now, when they find me in my tomb, I'm going to be surrounded by implements of femininity.
What that big mixing device you have?
My Thermomix. I will be buried with my Thermomix. Yes, actually, Danielle, I want to come back on the Femsplainer sometime and just talk about the Thermomix, how much I love it, and how it is.
I'll tell you what, if you can get Thermomix as a sponsor, we're on.
Okay.
We're on. In the meantime, I still reserve the right to make fun of moon genders.
Okay.
We didn't even get into talk about sun genders. So anyway, Meghan, thanks for joining. That was a lot of fun.
It was indeed.
Thanks, y'all. And we'll see you next week. And maybe we'll have a result to this election by the next time
maybe
we all meet. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. The Femsplainers is a weekly podcast carried on the Ricochet Network and available pretty much on every podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and watch video of our interviews on YouTube. You'll find links to everything, plus how to contact us directly at femsplainers.com. We survive and depend on your support. Like the show? Consider donating as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/femsplainers and get our exclusive monthly bonus episode, Last Call, in which you get to join the conversation with our guests. And there's much more. And a big shout out of thanks to our audio and video editor, Nat Frum.